So we're coming near the end of the book of Revelation. We are kind of as we get closer to the end, we have a number of visions that expand on some of the ideas that have went before, right? Like really, in many ways, the visions of judgment, the bowl visions that Kaylee talked about last week, that sort of ends the scroll. The contents of the scroll that was given to the Lamb. And now we have sort of these three sort of, extrapolations or expansions of that. Today, it's about Babylon and the fall of Babylon. And then next week, we'll take a look at the final judgment of the beasts and the dragon. And then we get into the fullness of the coming of God's kingdom. When we have this amazing vision in the last couple chapters of the coming kingdom of God and the new heavens and new earth. Now, today as we sort of start talking about the Babylon, or, which really is where I want to sort of highlight a couple things by way that this is a close-up. This is sort of where we get into a little bit more detail on the seventh bowl. And so at least that's the way I sort of understand it, that it's not sort of, strictly chronologically, but as we've seen with the book of Revelation, it often will kind of start back at the time of Christ, and then it will go forward, then it will go back to that time and go forward a little bit more. And so here you have this similar sort of going back, and now we get a close-up where we get a magnifying glass, and we're looking in more detail about the fall of Babylon. And this is something which we've seen, even at the end of chapter 16, that's where the fall of Babylon was also mentioned, where it talks in verse 19, the great city, that great city, which is Babylon, was split into three parts, and the cities of the nations collapsed. God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath. And so there we have, even before this, a precursor or foreshadowing of the judgment of Babylon. And then in chapter 14, we saw this as well, where you have the second beast, or the beast coming out of the sea, and Babylon's judgment then was announced. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries. And so here we get a close-up. And it's this sort of this narration of this rise and fall of the beastly powers, and behind them all is Satan. And so as we look at these passages, as we've explored them in some detail, we see behind the veil. We have this sense that in the world that we find ourselves in, that there's more that's going on than meets the eye. And here at the center of this, we find this talk about Babylon, this portrait of Babylon, as presented as this great prostitute. And so here, usually when you look at a chiasm, when you have a structure like this in Scripture, that the focus is on the middle. And that's where we find ourselves. And I think that the reason why the focus here is on the middle is that for the first century Christians, it's one thing to talk about the devil and abstract evil and all this, but they lived in Babylon. That was sort of their everyday experience, living in Babylon or in Rome, in this empire. And so it sort of is, here we get an understanding of the challenge for those trying to follow Jesus in the midst of a world that is in rebellion against God. And so this is where it really comes real for us. And I think that's why it's sort of at the center of this structure. So here you have in this passage a satirical portrait of Babylon or of Rome. And I know I'll talk about, who is Babylon, but it's Rome. I'll let you know that right now. And here you find that this passage it's a lampoon of Rome. That it's like a political cartoon, right? Where you have, political cartoons that somehow talk about American politics. They'll have Uncle Sam represented, and that represents the nation as a whole. Or you'll have a donkey that represents the Democrats, or an elephant that represents the Republicans, and so on. So you have these cartoons that usually use satire and exaggeration to sort of make their point. And part of why they need to do this is to sort of shock people out of their complacency, to get you to realize that, well, maybe there's more to this, to sort of the policies or the whatever's going on in the world today, and that we need to sort of see. So there's this sense that satire or satirical portraits like this, they unmask something for what it truly is, so that it can be resisted. Like that's the whole point of this portrait, this use of symbolism and portraying the Roman Empire as this great prostitute. And so it unmasks something for what it truly is. And this exaggerated portrayal is designed to sort of shock you, to its seductive powers of evil, and especially from complacency and accommodation. And when it comes down to it, the task here isn't to somehow decode the symbolism. Oh, who is this great prostitute? Who is this? Who is Babylon? Because it's pretty explicit and pretty clear in this passage that Babylon is meant to be understood as a Roman Empire in the first century. But it's far more than just the Roman Empire, right? But the point that John is doing in this vision is for us to understand what is he really talking about. And so I want to read part of the passage here for us. But it is an evocative and disturbing image of Babylon and all the ways that it works in the world. So let's read. Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. With her, the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand, filled with the abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery: Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. Initially, you get sort of a glamorous portrayal of this woman, right? She's wearing purple, scarlet, those are high class, those are expensive colors to wear in clothing, and the elite in the Roman Empire would usually wear that. So she's wearing purple, scarlet, she's glittering with gold and precious stones and pearls, and she's drinking from a beautiful, captivating golden cup. And so a lot of this here is this very similar to depictions of the goddess Roma, right? Where Rome and the god of the city was presented as this beautiful woman, right? Who sits, and this is from a coin from the time of Vespasian. And you see Roma sitting on 7 mountains. Here's a sketch of it so you can see the detail a little bit clearer. But here you have this idea that it starts out as this glamorous portrayal, where everyone sort of knows what John's talking about, but then it turns and descends into what would be an offensive description of Rome as a common prostitute or whore. That she's riding, instead of sitting, on a throne or anything like that, instead she's sitting on an evil 7-headed beast. Instead of the cup being filled with wine or anything like that, it's filled with the abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. And she is drunk with the blood of God's holy people. And so you have this, what maybe was this initially, picture that of Rome as this beautiful woman, as a goddess. It really, John takes it and satirizes it, and it becomes this offensive picture as Rome as a whore. And you know what? I find that language in this picture somewhat offensive, right? Like for my own ears, like, the NIV will translate it as prostitute, but really the sense of the word is far worse than that. But the key point here is to keep in mind that it also would have been offensive in the first century. And I think that's sort of John's point. The point of this vision is to shock them, that they think that Rome is represented as this beautiful goddess, and who is, someone to be desired and all this, and instead John presents her as a prostitute. Robin Whitaker, in her book, Revelation for Normal People, she comments, Revelation portrays Rome not as a beautiful courtesan or queen or goddess, but as a drunken, bloodthirsty whore who is fully aligned with evil and who will be destroyed by God. The challenge for the modern reader is to appreciate that there is a legitimate critique of empire and its injustice here, but it comes wrapped in ancient cultural norms relating to women's bodies. And so this language is meant to be evocative. It is meant to shock us and to disturb us. But, for the rest of the sermon, I'm just going to use the term prostitute rather than what maybe would be more close to the Greek. Now, the question is here, well, who is this woman? And I've kind of already let you know what I think, but I think John gives us several clues to solve the so-called mystery of her identity, none of which are particularly subtle, right? So, she's named Babylon the Great, which is used as symbolic of Rome. Like in 1 Peter chapter 5, that Peter says, she who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you her greetings, and so does my son Mark, right? So here you have this idea that at that time, Rome was referred to as Babylon. And it makes sense, right? Because historically, that Babylon was the evil empire, was the nation that God had used to exile the Israelites, like the kingdom. And also they destroyed the temple. And so now you have Rome, who also is this massive empire, and who in 70 AD destroyed the second temple built by Herod. And so this name fits, right? And the description of all that Babylon was historically very much fits with what Rome was doing at that time and place. It also, the vision talks about how this prostitute sits on the seven-headed beast, which is then later in verse 9 equated with the 7 hills. The 7 heads are the 7 hills on which the woman sits in 17 verse 9. And this is how Rome was portrayed and known in literature as well as in imagery. And so that the coin that I showed earlier, well, where is Rome, the goddess, sitting? You can see it clearly and you can count them. Right, there's 7 hills. And Rome was known as the city that sits on 7 hills. And so this allusion sort of is pretty explicit. Any first century Christian, reading this vision or hearing this vision would know that, okay, this is talking about Rome. It also goes on and talks about how she sits by many waters, which later in verse 15 is equated with the peoples, multitudes, and nations over which she has influence. And the stretch of the Roman Empire was vast, right? That it was sort of one of the first true superpowers, where it was over and reigned over many peoples and multitudes and nations. And then at the end of the chapter in verse 18, it very clearly says that she is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. And so it's pretty clear to pretty much, most scholars, every scholar, that this is a reference to the Roman Empire, in which the original readers and the recipients of this book would have found themselves within. And the question is, well, how do you live faithfully in Babylon, in Rome? And so it's clear in my mind that the prostitute is Rome, but it's also more than just Rome, right? And when you look at how this picture, this portrait is portrayed, that it's rooted in the prophetic critiques of Babylon that you see in Jeremiah, in Ezekiel, a number of places. And there's a number of actual verbatim quotes from these passages describing Rome. But it also goes back to the critiques of Nineveh, right? The capital of Assyria. That's the city that Jonah was sent to. And Jonah didn't want to go there, right? And not because, he was scared, but he didn't want them to repent because they were, before Babylon, they were sort of Assyria was the other evil empire that oppressed the northern kingdom in particular. But then it also comes up again in the prophetic critiques of Tyre, one of the cities up further north on the coast. And so the language here that John pulls from all these other places in the Old Testament, as well as, it's hard not to think of the Tower of Babel and that ancient story that's recorded in Genesis chapter 11, because in Hebrew, Babel is the same as Babylon. And there's all these other allusions. And here, Babylon, and the Tower of Babel, where all of humanity gathered together and they wanted to become like God and build a tower to reach to heaven, right? So there's this sense that all of these different kingdoms, whatever name they have, that when they kind of go beyond their boundaries or their dictates, that they become like Babel. And so there's symbolic of humanity and rebellion against God in any and all ages. So for the first century Christians, that it was Rome, right? It was Rome that was right in their face, that they were living in this Roman Empire. And that was where, the people living in those 7 churches and in the Roman Empire as Christ followers, that this is what they were constantly faced with, is how to remain faithful in the context of this political system that they found themselves in. But it had precursors to all these other empires before, whether it was the Egyptians, whether it was the Assyrians, or the Babylonians, or the Persians, or the Greeks. And I think that it's also symbolic for any sort of system that we come across today that has its odds against God's purposes. And so Michael Gorman, in his book, Reading Revelation Responsibly, he talks about Babylon as a system of domination that both seduces the powerful, partially with the promise of more power, and intoxicates the common people with the false promise of security, and supposedly comes from increasing prosperity and power. So here it's this domination system that we can find ourselves in, whether we live in Canada, the States, Russia, or anywhere in the world, when government kind of goes too far, in their powers. And there's multiple marks of Babylon, or this idea of empire, that's referred to, but it can be boiled down, I think, to multiple forms of, on the one hand, injustice. Right? When you read through this passage, that one of the marks of the Roman Empire and Babylon before it, and Persia and Assyria, all these other nations, was one of injustice, where they would exploit others, often with violence. Right? These were all brutal empire. They were their Harkonnens, if you're going to go see Dune, right? They were the evil empire that they would exploit others for its own economic gain. They would pursue luxury and neglect the poor, and they ultimately treat humans created in God's image as goods to be traded, as you find in chapter 18, verse 13, where it talks about the slave trade, right, at that time. That this is sort of what it is. And then later on in chapter 18, where you have this dirge, where you have the kings of the earth and the merchants and the sailors, they're lamenting for the fall of Babylon, but they're not lamenting because of her demise. They're lamenting by the fact that they realize that her demise will impact their own prosperity, because they had hooked up, with Babylon. And they were sort of trying to sort of fit in with her and to kowtow to her. And then now they realize with Babylon gone that they're left with nothing. And so injustice is a characteristic of Babylon. But then also idolatry. Because the problem with Babylon is that in any nation that it arrogantly makes promises and demands and claims that are appropriate only for God to make. Right? This idea of allegiance, right? That ultimately our allegiance is to God as a Christ follower. And these secondary allegiances that we see, that they have to come second. And for the early, the Christians living in the first century, that at times they found themselves at odds with empire as they were emperor worship was demanded. And they felt that, okay, it would be easy just to go and pinch a little bit of incense and burn it in the temple. But that would involve them, giving allegiance and worshiping the empire. And they felt they couldn't do that. And so this idolatry is always part of Babylonian-like powers. And so when we turn to chapter 18, we see that, that Babylon is fallen. That Babylon, that is the celebratory dirge that shows above all whatever else we want to talk about Babylon and its influence in the Roman Empire or just empire, that it's judged and therefore doomed. And so you have in this passage in chapter 18, what a mighty voice this angel shouted, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons and a haunt for every impure spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable animal." And so you have this dirge which sort of highlights the judgment that God will one day bring on any evil empire. And despite its vast influence, despite how stable you think that this empire was, that Babylon's demise will be swift. Right? In verse 8 of chapter 18, it talks about how it'll be 1 hour. Therefore, in one day, her plagues will overtake her. Death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. And then 3 times where you have these 3 woes, by the kings of the earth and the merchants and the sailors, that in each one of them they talk about how Babylon's demise will be 1 hour. Woe to you, great city, you mighty city of Babylon. In 1 hour your doom has come. So this picture that you have of Babylon, and there's lots of other details, I just decided to skip because I really didn't want to have another real long sermon, and it's communion. But I also wanted to be practical today in the sense of, well, if the first century Christians, that they sort of, that here you have this vision, this offensive vision of Babylon, of Rome. And then the question is, well, how do they live? This was their struggle. That was the whole point of this vision is, well, that they need to wake up. And so as they wake up in Babylon, there's this call to wake up. And in chapter 18, verse 4, that here the angel says, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues." And I think that there's, in terms of, well, what does this mean in practical terms? I think there's 3 things that I want to highlight. And first, that we need to recognize the marks of Babylon in our own culture, right? They needed to recognize in their culture in the first century, where the Roman Empire reached over where they should have and where they sort of had demands upon the people and the early Christians in ways that they couldn't follow. But we also need to recognize in our own culture, in Canada, United States, and all this, like where we find the marks of Babylon. And when you think of it, that most early Christ followers would have been served well enough by the Roman Empire, right? For most of them, especially when there wasn't any active persecution, right? The Roman Empire did a lot of good things. They had great roads, right? I always see every spring, there's always some memes that will show some pictures of Edmonton roads with all the potholes that we have, and then some Roman road that was built like 2,000 years ago. But for most early Christians, it wasn't an issue. When Paul was writing Romans, during the reign of Claudius, so, around the 50s, that here, he said that you let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. So on the one hand, you have this very positive view of government, right, and even the Roman Empire. But then you also have this scathing portrait from the book of Revelation of Rome as evil empire. And I think what's going on here is that when governments, nations, whatever, when they go beyond their legitimate mandate and they act in beastly ways, right, that they become Babylon or they become empire. And so, during the time, of the first century, there were times where Nero and other emperors, where they persecuted Christ followers, when Domitian, when he, called for everyone to worship him and to claim this divine status, that at those points they went beyond what they could rightly claim for themselves. And I think here that one of the challenges that we find is we're in the middle of it. We're like that proverbial frog in the water that's slowly coming to temperature. And we sometimes don't recognize, ways that our culture, our government, and life here in Canada is sort of calling us and compromising our faith in some ways. Mennonite scholar Nelson Craybill, in his book, Imperial Cult and Commerce, says this: particularly in democratic societies in which government fulfill a range of productive and healthy roles, Christians cannot simply adopt John's stance of categorical condemnation. Sectarian withdrawal from society is not a valid option if the church can actively engage the power, so to speak, or act for justice and truth. Yet John's keen insight into spiritual dimensions of political power might help us see that even the best of governments sometimes make choices or demands that followers of Jesus must challenge. Christians in economically and politically powerful nations, in the terminology of Revelation, Christians who live more in Babylon than on Patmos, from our position of relative security and comfort, it may be difficult to hear or accept John's radical critique of imperial power, a critique that seems logical to many people in the two-thirds world. And, what he's getting at here is that sometimes that here, in our affluent culture, that we don't necessarily see ourselves in the way that the two-thirds world might see us. That we're blind to it. And there is something to this seductive allure of evil and ease which we can become complicit in injustice and idolatry. And it's alarming at how easy it can become. It's often, seen clearer as we look back and we see sort of other nations and other times in history where, oh yeah, how could they do that? Right? But, hindsight's always 20/20. And here John's portrait that we have in this passage is painted with extremes, right, and exaggerations, but not because the distinction between good and evil is obvious, but rather it's not. Right? It's not obvious, and so he wants to have us recognize that distinguishing between good and evil, or between the true God or surrogate gods that we're asked to worship, or idols, or between faithfulness and unfaithfulness, is often difficult and requires discernment. That it's not, in the first century, it wasn't easy to follow Jesus in first century Rome. And I don't think it's easy in 21st century Canada. And it requires discernment. And if we look at the 7 churches that we looked at right at the beginning of this, we saw how, in Sardis and Laodicea, that they were lulled into complacency by their wealth. And they didn't think about injustices. They were just wanting to sort of partner with others that would make them wealthy and successful. Why those at Pergamum and Thyatira, that they were enticed by idolatry into accommodating their faith. Well, it doesn't matter if I do that, does it? I can still do that and worship Jesus. And John here paints this picture that is pretty black and white. But part of that is because, that it is sometimes difficult to distinguish between how we should live. So we need to recognize, we need to sort of be able to look at our world and not be pushed into its mold. But then we also need to resist accommodation and complacency, especially in regards to injustice and idolatry. So we need to resist. And the people of God, when you look at it throughout history, they have a long history of recognizing and resisting beastly empires, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Greece, and in this passage, Rome. And so throughout this, we need to recognize that, we need to resist accommodation. We need to, resist being complacent or complicit. And resistance can take many different forms. But I think that it's important that I believe that it will always reflect the way of the Lamb. That Jesus is our example, where he laid down his life, that he resisted, and he spoke truth to the powers, but he also laid down his life, and he did it in a nonviolent way. And so however we resist, and of course in a democratic country that we can resist in a number of different ways, through writing letters, through, demonstrations, that's what it is. I was trying to think what's I call, there's all this sort of stuff where we can fight for and against injustices in our world. And then we also have to recognize, and for us this seems far more distant, but I think in other places in the world that this sort of resistance, this sort of faithfulness to Jesus might be costly. Right? In Revelation chapter 2, verse 13, John talks about Antipas, faithful witness who was put to death in the first century. And we know of other persecutions, that the Roman Empire, and they got worse over time, that they did. And we know in other places throughout the world where being a Christ follower is something that may easily cost you your life. But that doesn't mean, that we would live any different. So we need to recognize, we need to resist, but then we need to remember whose we are. And this is where it comes down to allegiance, right? As Christ followers, whether we're in Canada or in the States or in Mexico, warmer in Mexico, our primary allegiance is to Christ and to this transnational kingdom of God, right? That as Christ followers, the church is in all nations, and our whole mission is to sort of make disciples, right, of all nations. And so, some of the marks of Babylon, like this extreme nationalism that you see coming up in various places, and the exploitation and the militarism and all this, we can talk about that as well. But for Christ followers, our allegiance, first and foremost, above everything else, is to Jesus. And as we come together this morning and we celebrate the Lord's Supper, that's exactly, what we're doing. That on the one hand, we're remembering, Christ's death on our behalf. We're seeing how Jesus himself, that he laid down his life so that we may have new life. And that he took upon himself the sins of the world so that we may be forgiven, that we may be reconciled to God, but then also reconciled to one another. So it's an act of remembering, right? It says, do this in remembrance of me. But it's also, I would like to add, it's an act of resistance. That when we come together and as we celebrate, and as we take the cup and we take the bread, that it's an act of resistance where we're recognizing that our faith in Jesus means our allegiance is to Jesus alone. That when we come together, that when we take this cup, that, we're not drinking. Like there's almost this, in this portrait of this great prostitute, the one commentary talked about how it's an evil parody of the Lord's Supper, where she's sitting there with this goblet and she's drunk with the blood of the saints. And here today, as we take the cup, symbolic of Jesus' blood spilt on our behalf, that it's saying that we side with the Lamb, right, over empire, over Babylon, over the beast, or whatever you want to call it, all these different images that the book of Revelation highlights.